Well, and I think it's fair to say that most of the general public have probably run out of sympathy when it comes to the striking train drivers. But the problem is here that if they're going to say 18 more months of disruption, people's lives are going to continue to be blighted by this unless it's sorted out. What is the way forward?
Well, I fear that there's no solution to this before the general election. And I think that Aslef have made it plain they're going to continue this action until a new government comes in, assuming there will be a new government. And they are hoping, no doubt, that at that point they'll get a fairer deal from an incoming Labour or coalition government than they will do from the present Conservative government. I think they might be misguided, actually, on that front. But it's interesting, I think, today to hear the anger expressed by the Prime Minister about the train operating companies, and in particular their refusal to use this new piece of legislation. Personally, I've always thought the legislation was flawed and unworkable, so I'm not surprised that they're not being introduced by train companies on a day-to-day basis. But my understanding is that the reason the government brought this law in is because they were lobbied by the train companies before the 2019 general election to put it in the Conservative Party manifesto. The Conservatives then did so, and then the train companies won't use it, which explains perhaps the anger from number 10.
Indeed. I think it's a bit strange. I mean, if everybody walks out on strike from your company, I'm not saying that the train companies have suffered this, but suppose everyone walks out, Rishi can't turn around and say, oh, well, we passed a law saying you've got to keep a 40% service. Well, we haven't got the staff to do it. So I think it's another one of, it's a bit like his Rwanda is safe legislation. It's another one of his fantasy laws that don't really relate to reality. But can I ask you one other aspect of this, Norman? I mean, the train drivers are asking for 12%, a 12% pay rise, which would take their pay up to something like $65,000 a year. They've been offered 8.9%. Surely it's incumbent upon Aslef to put that, what sounds to me like a very reasonable offer, to their membership. They can reject it if they like, but surely they should have the opportunity.
Well, I agree with that. I think any pay deal which is offered democratically ought to be put to the membership of the union. And of course, that's where it went terribly wrong, if you go back in the past, with Arthur Scargill and the miners, who refused to put the offer to the miners, and that ended in tragedy for the miners. But, you know, I've got some sympathy with Aslef in the sense that there are huge payouts being given to the top people in the rail industry for sometimes quite poor service on some of the lines. Sometimes franchises have been taken away, and yet they're still giving them bonuses out big time. On the other hand, from the employer's point of view, the reality is that Aslef drivers have been doing very well since privatisation, ironically, because before privatisation, there was one employer, British Rail, to negotiate with. Since privatisation, there's been a multitude of employers, and because it's expensive to train a train driver, it's been cheaper for companies to poach drivers from other companies and give them an increased salary to do that, because paying them slightly more on a day-to-day basis is cheaper than training a new driver. So they've pushed up the rates themselves, the companies.
What sort of impact do you think these strikes cumulatively are having on the country economically? I mean, it must be doing a vast amount of injury to businesses who are not getting either footfall from people coming to visit cities or towns, and then those whose employees can't turn up to work.
Yes, I mean, there were key workers, clearly, who were protected during the COVID problem by trains being run. And of course, on days like this, there are no trains. I mean, I'm now speaking to you from Lewis rather than being with you in the studio in London Bridge, which I would normally do. So there's one example of an impact immediately on your programme. But of course, the reality is that people now have got more flexibility. Many people have got more flexibility in their work. After COVID, working from home has become more established. People are picking and choosing to some extent what days they go into the office. And therefore, I think the impact of the strike is probably less effective than it would have been, say, 10 years ago.
I'll tell you what, Norman, I'll put up with a lot of the discomfort caused by these strikes, but you not being in the studio, I draw the line out.
I know, it's a bridge too far.
Seriously, though, you're a former Transport Minister. What would you be doing if you were Transport Minister now to try to sort this mess out? Although, as you said earlier, it could well be that these train drivers, this is political, not actually financial. They want a Labour government. But what would you be doing taking that on board?
Well, I think we get them all around the table and just try and negotiate with them. And I think perhaps try to, I don't know what I would do, to be honest with you. I think it's an impossible situation, but get them all around the table, which they seem not to have done for quite some time. might be a start. You know, I've got some sympathy with the government because you've got the unions who I think are not going to agree to anything beside the general election, no matter how generous it is. And I think you've got on the other side, you've got employers, frankly, who are looking at a Labour government coming in and are paying themselves large bonuses and cutting costs to maximise the return for the companies in anticipation of something unpleasant happening to them after the election. So, you know, the government's in a no-win situation, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, this wargaming that perhaps if they, you know, get a Labour government, that actually the Labour government will give them a better settlement. You were saying earlier that that probably is not the case.
I don't think it is the case. And I mean, all the evidence from what's been said by Rachel Reeves and her team, and indeed Keir Starmer, is that they want to be, quote, fiscally responsible, unquote. And I think if for a Labour government to come in and the first thing to do is give an excessive, what many people would see as an excessive pay rise to train drivers, would not be a very good start for them in their own terms. So I think they will be determined not to do that. So I think if Aslef are holding out for that, then they may be disappointed.
Norman, great to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time, Norman.